Um, oh, hold on. Yeah, together with, I guess, yeah, delight and anxiety, probably kind of like the two main experiences on a daily basis.
Right. Where does the anxiety come from?
Well, I mean, I guess there's there's something that I didn't take into account before I decided to be a father, which is the amount of fear that would come attached to it.
Right.
There was a very sudden transition. It's I don't know exactly how to frame it, but there's a sudden transition in the sense that overnight there was something in this world more important to me that I couldn't have fathomed that would be that important other than just kind of like my own well-being, right? So
Right.
like there's something else in the world now that is yeah, like the most important thing. And that is the kind of thing that obviously I guess carries with it a lot of fear when anything happening, the pain that goes along with any sort of suffering. Like
Yeah.
I can take my pain, I can take a lot of things for myself, but then when it comes to my daughter, then that's kind of obviously intensified or magnified when it comes to like just the expectation of anything she
Right.
might go through.
Yeah. It is. It is a particularly interesting watching the world fall apart around the kids as well.
Right. Yes. So
And
there,
of which,
yeah.
because they do have their own problems and they do have their own pains, but they're not really aware of that yet. Like that
Yeah.
kind of hasn't sunk in. We live in a small, quiet place and everything is very idyllic, within our bubble. But and then so there's that, and then a little bit closer to home, in our psychedelic community, as it grows and it's going through its own sort of growing pains, people often say it's like, oh, like when are you going to introduce your kids to psychedelics?
Hmm.
And so first of all, not for a while,
Hmm.
and then also the landscape is changing so quickly. Who knows what it even looks like by the time they're teenagers? And then third, why do people think I have anything to do with it? Like my
Hmm.
parents didn't like introduce me to psychedelics. Did your parents
Right.
introduce you to psychedelics?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. Yeah. So like the first thing that you said, I think, yeah, I mean, a big part of the anxiety obviously relates to the collective predicaments and both social and environmental. I guess like in the most simple way to articulate it is just a deep awareness that I have no fucking idea what kind of world she's gonna grow up in, right? Like
Right.
what kind of world we're gonna be living in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, what kind of world she's going to inherit and what kind of life she's going to be able to build within those parameters. That was something that was on my mind for a long time before I actually decided to become a father. Like for a very long time, like my instincts were like don't, like don't. There's no real reason why to bring children to the
Hmm.
world as it is. But something started shifting as time went by for different reasons, and I think like one of the things that I find very helpful nowadays. This is actually something that I heard from Daniel Schmachtenberger in one interview that he gave. But the context
Oh.
basically was, yeah,
No, go ahead. I know this one, but go ahead.
the context was kind of like basically making a distinction between optimism and hope, right?
Mm.
And optimism really kind of like being an attitude that we take based on a prediction. Well, like we kind of like we compile information about the world to the best of our ability and knowledge about what's happening, social, cultural, political, environmental, like all sorts of different things in this particular case, and then kind of like throw a prediction of what might the world look like in 10, 15, 20 years. And in that kind of like narrow sense of optimism, then I'm not a very optimistic person. Like I don't think that things are going to, I personally don't think that things are getting better or they're going to be getting better anytime soon. And probably things are going to get much worse before they get better. So in that kind of like sense of optimism about the kind of world that she's going to inherit, speaking about my daughter, then I'm not a very optimistic person, which makes it very difficult to not have anxiety and radical fear in
Hmm.
relation to the kind of world that she's going to grow up. But then, right, there's a distinction between optimism and hope. And then hope being not necessarily the result of a particular prediction based on what we think the future is going to be like or a particular outcome is going to be like, but rather a moral imperative, right? Like a moral attitude towards things, that no matter what the prediction might be, or no matter what the actual outcome is, that we should remain hopeful that things can be better and they should be better, right? And that was kind of like the thing that eventually tipped the scales in the terms of choosing to be a parent or not, because I came to a realization that to some extent my lack of optimism, right, or my pessimism in this particular sense was based on my particular understanding of what the world is and what it could be, right? But that doesn't mean that those are the only options, right? The fact that I can't imagine any real solutions to our collective predicaments doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? That's kind of like that's kind of like the framework. You know, and then kind of like a belief that, you know, the fact that our generation and probably the generation below us can't really figure it out doesn't mean that perhaps, you know, think about my daughter, for example. She's going to be born into a world where she's not really going to have much choices. Her and her generation, right? Like the moment that they acquire consciousness about what the world is like at some point during their youth, it's likely that they're not going to have much choice but to like address, face, you know, straight, like face on to address like really the environmental, social, political predicaments, because they're just going to have like, hopefully they're going to have like that deep awareness that they don't have the same privilege that we have to ignore these things for decades and just revel on hedonism and distraction and all the different things that we do in order to distract ourselves from the real issues, you know, in the world. Like they're not going to have that privilege. And I guess if there is some hope, right, I think that it's going to come from somebody or some people, some collectives in those generations that are not really going to have any choice but to head on first, foremost, kind of like deal with these things. What I say, invention is the mother of necessity, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Invention is the mother of necessity. So, you know, I have hope that my daughter and her generation and her peers, they will be able to come up with ideas, solutions, systems that we haven't been able to come up with.
Right. Hopefully. It's interesting because I look at optimism as different. I feel like my optimism comes from, I guess, my own necessity, like my own necessity to kind of like show up and make sure that like things keep going and I'm putting my best out there, and the things that I feel like I need to do, like I'm continually doing and showing up for, even in the face of kind of a world that is kind of crumbling. And so with that in mind, you know, based on the work that you do in the fields that you work in, like, how do you do your part to kind of set them up? Like if we're kind of setting them up for the jump shot, like how do you do that? How do we do our best in the meantime?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, in the very narrow domain of the things that I'm currently interested in, which kind of like to distill it, something that I call healing culture. And healing culture is something that I made up basically to kind of like articulate that intersection of different things that I saw or have seen converging within this thing that I call healing culture, right? And within this healing culture, there's all sorts of different things, including kind of like all the modern modalities of healing, right? Both psychological and spiritual, some of the medical, very, very heavily informed by alternative medicine, heavily informed by New Age spirituality, heavily informed by some orientalized version of Eastern systems and philosophies.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah.
But go on.
Same. I mean, you know, many years ago, I spent a year in India, very much kind of like chasing these snippets of wisdom that, you know, a lot of that is great, but, you know, the Orientalist part is, we're maybe going to go back to it, kind of like the romanticized, idealized component as it gets filtered through kind of like the weird, by the way, is an acronym that I'm using nowadays instead of Western, because Western seems to not be very useful anymore as a descriptive of a particular group of people. Where this acronym, I forget the name of the guy, Heinrich, he wrote a book about it. Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Right? It's kind of like this encompassing label for white, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. Other ways of saying that, the global north and so on and so forth.
Right.
But yeah, so as things get filtered through kind of like the weird filter, right? So we have kind of like this conglomerate of ideas and cherry-picked parts of very complex and beautiful Eastern systems and philosophies, ideas within mainstream Western psychology that kind of like then get kind of like popularized and decontextualized, and oftentimes completely losing their original meaning and just becoming kind of like these buzzwords, right? So this is kind of like the pop psychology part of it, popular psychology, which is a label that some people don't like. I personally don't have an issue with it, but like we have also different aspects of pop psychology that are very much ingrained within healing culture, right? Like all sorts of different ideas that perhaps originate within psychoanalysis or other sorts of like legitimate field of research and practice, but then get like really watered down and again like decontextualized from the original meaning, and then just used as these buzzwords for also different for TikTok videos mostly, right? Like, I mean, narcissist is great. Like everybody's a narcissist nowadays. Like
They sure are.
I'm sure that all of you have an ex-partner who is a narcissist, right? There's no selfish people anymore. There's no assholes anymore. Like somebody does something that we don't like and they're a narcissist. But no, I mean, narcissism is a real thing. I mean, at least in as much as clinical practice, like there's a proper way that we can diagnose and figure out where somebody kind of like fits the criteria for an actual narcissistic personality disorder, right? Which is very, very different than the way that most of us use that label nowadays in popular discourse. Again, mostly to refer to ex-partners that we don't like anymore. So we have pop psychology, we have Eastern traditions, we have Amazonian shamanism, for example, which is something that is very close to my heart because that's kind of like the field that I have been immersed for many years, both in practice and in research. That together, again, like cherry picking all sorts of different ideas and practices and concepts, and sometimes like full worldviews, right? And then piecing them together, filter through kind of like this weird filter, and then served to us mostly through social media, but not only, right? As healing culture. And that has been kind of like the thing that I've been trying to look at, deconstruct, talk about. Not necessarily, I mean, again, just kind of to go back to your original question, because I think I wandered into many tangents. So this is something that I kind of like try to convey in my page, because it's very easy to be an outsider criticizing something when you're outside looking into something that you don't really understand or don't really, you're not really invested in. But this is not the case, right? Like the page that I run, the criticism that I offer is not from an outsider looking. It's like from somebody that's very invested in these communities, has been working with people for a very long time in all sorts of different capacities, and not because I want to talk shit about it, but because I want to make it better. Like that's kind of like the answer to your question. Like what I want to live. I believe in healing. I believe in transformation. I believe in healing and transformation culture. I believe that people that are like really honestly invested in their own personal betterment in whatever way it is, they're like really people that deserve a lot of praise and respect. Yeah, like there's something that I heard so many times in my time working in retreat centers, for example. It kind of like becomes a mantra of healing culture. It's a very hyper individualistic take on these things, but they basically kind of like say, the best gift that you can offer the world is your personal healing and transformation, which is true to some extent. Yeah, like I think it's very, very important. Yeah, it's very, very important that like we don't choose our circumstances, but we do to some extent choose how we react to them, and we have agency, right, in overcoming whatever things we need to overcome in life. And I do think that it's a great gift that we can offer ourselves and our loved ones and the world at large to honestly and earnestly try to heal and grow and continue learning and continue healing. And but there's oftentimes a transition that is missed in kind of like the Western weird healing culture approach, which doesn't really prime people to make the transition between the individual and the collective. Yeah, and I think like a lot of that has to do with kind of like the underlying ideologies that govern our life in a macro level. Yeah, neoliberalism being the chief amongst them, right? Like this thing that started as an economic doctrine, then kind of became a political doctrine, and then became like really culture. Like neoliberalism nowadays is like the root of weird culture. This idea that society is an abstraction and everything, the only thing that matters is the individual experience, right? So that transition between my individual healing and how can I actually make things better for everybody else? At which point do I stop peeling layers of the onion? Right? Like at which point do I decide, hey, I've done enough work on myself, and I'm fit and ready to now also be of service to other people, to be of service, to look at structures, right? Like I think like that's a part of the healing process that I would like to see more of, that people are able to say, hey, this is not about me anymore. like how do I yank myself out of the self-absorption, of that kind of like vortex of self-indulgence, and hey, well, what is it in my immediate surrounding that I can actually start doing better for everybody else in a structural way?
Well,
yeah.
Well, this seems to be, again, built into neoliberalism. I hope I'm using it the same way you are, where the struggles for survival keeps increasing, even among people who have, an ability to distract and have kind of disposable income and entertainment and things like that, going to festivals to distract themselves from Rome burning and the like. Because the struggles for survival, how do I say this? Well, I'm thinking of, everybody's a narcissist, right? Everybody's a narcissist. Everybody has trauma. Everybody has autism. And this is because everybody's getting diagnosed on social media and nobody has access to medical care. Right. And so, for example, we have a society where people don't have decent medical care. And how can you start to care about the rest of the world and the systems and changing the world where you're like worried that, where 50% of the world can't deal with a $600 expense, a $600 emergency. And so it's really tricky to, we were talking earlier about punching up and punching down. How do you insist that somebody who doesn't know how they're going to make rent start to deal with systemic issues, and then people who are perhaps just barely able, they're doing okay, they can cover rent, but if they rock the boat, maybe that changes, right? Maybe the rug gets pulled out from under them and they've managed to kind of secure a little tiny bit of safety for once. And so how do we ask people and how do we invite people into looking a little bit broader and doing what they need to do while still feeling like they're not totally at risk, even though we know we're always at risk?
Yeah. I mean, great. These are really the big questions. So I mean, one tagline that I use a lot throughout my page, right, is soft on people and hard on systems. This is not mine. It's something that I took. But like, different versions of it is something that I do try to convey that message quite a lot. Soft on people, hard on systems. Yeah, like we're never never like trashing the individual person who is just trying to survive under neoliberalism and late capitalism, doing their best, right, to survive or thrive, but rather using individual examples to illuminate structural issues, which is a very different thing. And I think in the US is very tricky. I mean, I'm not from the US, and I don't have a very deep understanding of the medical system, at least not visceral. I mean, I understand how it works. I do understand that there's, the for-profit medical industrial complex obviously doesn't make it easy for people to not run towards alternatives when they find them. Yeah, like it seems like people are always one medical emergency away from being bankrupt, which is stressful. Yeah, this is the reality of things. Under a for-profit medical system within a neoliberal apparatus, these things, to some extent, they're designed that way.
Mm-hmm.
Because like there has to
Right,
be that.
the lizards made it that way.
Right. So I mean, probably gonna maybe we can get to the conspiracy component, which I didn't mention as I was explaining the different influences of healing culture. But conspiracy culture is definitely a huge component of it. And by the way, when I mean conspiracy culture, I don't. This is always tricky. This is whenever I post anything about conspiracies. This is always when I get into the most hot water with people. Yeah, I mean, and I think like. The way that I refer to conspiracy is not necessarily about conspiracy culture as if all conspiracies people believe are stupid or dumb. I think people gravitate towards conspiratorial thinking for very good reasons. It's important to examine kind of the underlying reasons why people don't have faith in certain systems, or why people would choose to not fully not fully take the word of institutionalized media, for example, or political institutions, per se, but rather kind of gravitate towards alternative sources of information. But when I talk about conspiracy, I oftentimes refer to it as conspiracy epistemics, which is just a different way of saying, it's about a framework that sometimes people adopt that is very, very common in our subcultures, through which people will try and will make sense of every single thing that happens in the world explicitly and exclusively through the lens of conspiracy culture, where there's an inherent mistrust and distrust in any official explanation, whether it's academic or political, or it doesn't matter. Like anything that happens will be seen exclusively through these lenses that are very prominent and prevalent in conspiracy epistemics. And I mean, we have plenty of examples throughout history of things that people thought were crazy conspiracies, but actually they were. Yeah. They were like the people, and I'm sure that many of the things that sometimes people get ridiculed for nowadays as, oh, you're just a conspiracy, in 20 years or 30 years, you just, obviously that's what it was. That's not necessarily the thing. The thing is like, culturally, right? Like this culture through which people will make sense exclusively through that kind of like InfoWars, Alex Jones, David Icke conspiracy lens that is inherently distrustful and seeding mistrust of every possible explanation. I think we strayed from what it was that we were talking about. Maybe rein me back.
We were talking about how do we take positive action in the direction of a future that we want to see?
Right. So I think, it's not about throwing the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Like, I think this is kind of like the main metaphor that will be very useful in this sense. Like, we're not talking shit about psychedelics and about healing culture, or it's pop psychology and conspiracy culture just for the sake of talking shit about it. Yeah. Like, there's an intention behind it, which is like, actually, maybe we can do better than these things. Maybe we can integrate better different ideas with different information, maybe different epistemic frameworks, so we can make better sense of information. Like, there's many underlying things that probably are at the root of some of the chaos that is currently rampant in healing culture. The neoliberal part, which is something that we were referring to before, right? Like, this is something that is very, very prominent, and this is something that I find to be particularly difficult in many of the healing spaces, right? Whereas they're really like, even to the extent that suffering becomes completely depoliticized, right? And this is something that is very, very dangerous when we start gaslighting people, right? By saying, hey, if you are depressed, this is this. By the way, a lot of the gaslighting happens also within institutional channels. Like, like I don't have, like I do have a lot of criticism, for example, for the way that biological psychiatry operates a lot of the time, right? But let's take, depression and anxiety as an example, because that's always kind of like a big component of the analysis that I did for my fieldwork in the Amazon, right? Like, a lot of people come with experiences of depression, right? And like depending on what is the preferred approach that they gravitate towards, whether it's more biological psychiatry or something alternative, then there's still kind of like an idea that the person is suffering from depression because there's some sort of imbalance with our neurochemistry, which is true, right? We do have an awareness that serotonin plays a huge role in our moods and so on and so forth. But I think like the important part, right, is the acknowledgement that if people are depressed and anxious, it's not only because something is inherently wrong with their specific personal brain, right? Because they're embedded within structures that are dysfunctional. Like if I struggle with anxiety, right, it's not only because there's something wrong with my nervous system that will be fixed if I just do enough cold plunges, right? If I'm struggling with anxiety, as many other people, it's because I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay rent because I'm working 2 or 3 jobs. And I know, right, that I'm one medical emergency from being bankrupt, right? That I don't have any hope in my lifetime. Well, I mean, you know, we don't have much hope in my lifetime of owning homes, depending on where it is that we live. Right, like that anxiety is both obviously personal and very deeply individual, but at the same time, it is embedded within these structures. There are social, there are cultural, there are political, and depoliticizing them is dangerous because then this is exactly what the neoliberal zeitgeist is priming us to do. Hey, you don't feel good? Are you depressed? Are you anxious? Well, take this pill and you're going to feel better. And if it's not through psychiatry, then hey, like, you know, do cold plunges or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
fashionable.
I've had to start adding new slides to, I teach mindfulness, right? And mindfulness is like really good at gaslighting. That like if you're unhappy, it's because there's greed, hatred, and ignorance. And if you conquered the greed, hatred, and ignorance, then you wouldn't have any other problems. And so, you know, giving the disclaimer to the students that, yeah, it's really good to get a handle, to learn the map of your mind and see how your processes work. And stuff is messed up.
Exactly.
And then figuring out how to ride that balance and how to kind of know your mind and to be able to rein yourself in when sometimes we are making a mountain out of a molehill, so that when, you know, so that we're not necessarily fighting windmills, but we're able to like show up for the battles that really matter.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, mindfulness is a great example. I mean, I definitely, right? Like, hey, and I mean, this is something that is also, I guess, very prominent, not only in mindfulness, but all sorts of different psycho-spiritual approaches, where there is kind of like this sort of idea, right? If we are able to master, no, feel all of our feelings and master all of our conditioned responses and so on and so forth, then we're not going to suffer anymore.
If you just put it all in the bucket,
right?
Like get all your sludge out into the bucket.
Exactly.
Which is interesting. So here's an interesting thing, just a little side, you talk about how we want to be able to humanize people. We're hard on systems. We're easy on people. Even if we disagree with people, we want to humanize them.
Right.
There's this phenomenon that I see in arguments sometimes where people discount other people because they haven't done enough psychedelics.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, if you just did more psychedelics, you would believe the same things politically that I believe.
Exactly.
You want to comment on that phenomenon?
Well, I mean, that was kind of like one of the main control strategies in the environments that was part of in the Amazon rainforest, right? Like, oh, you don't get it. It's because you haven't dieted enough, or you haven't drank ayahuasca as many times as I have, right? Or you haven't dieted with the right person. There's always kind of like this assumption that if you disagree with something, particularly when it comes to control issues or structural issues in tightly knit control communities, then it's a very easy thing. You know, this is the stuff that cults are made of. Oh, you don't see things as I do. Well, that just means that you're not doing your work. You haven't done your work. You need to keep peeling layers of the onion, so eventually you will see things as clearly as I do.
How many of your memes are autobiographical?
Well, I mean, I think most of them are. You know, like I think every project, more. Well, I mean, I'm not gonna say every, but you know, my field of inquiry, medical anthropology, but anthropology in general, right? Like ethnography is kind of like the main vehicle through which we make sense of things. And I always had the belief, which is not necessarily exclusively mine, that ethnography is always autobiographical. It's very difficult to detach the observer, our personal history, our personal understanding of things from the actual observation that we're doing. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the reason that Healing from Healing exists, it's at least the reason why it started. By the way, this is an interesting kind of like backstory, because I never expected it to become what it has become. Like I never thought, I thought maybe, there's going to be a handful of people who had been through similar experiences who might find it insightful or, funny or resonate with it. But in the beginning, it was kind of like my own way to vent about certain things that I thought, were harmful and stupid through in my own personal process. But then I started very quickly realizing these are very, very common shared concerns and shared experiences, and it grew like fast. But it definitely started as kind of like my own diary, I guess, to vent about my own. So sometimes one of the main criticisms that I've gotten throughout by the way, Healing from Healing is not very old. It's a project that started maybe a little bit under 2 years, very intermittently over the first year. And one of the things that I oftentimes do get from people is like, "Oh, Adam, you're just projecting your shadow." Which is very funny to me because, yeah, man, I mean, this whole page is my shadow. Like, it's all based on my need to work through all this stuff because they're very, very deeply ingrained in my personal experience. Again, we go back to kind of like this idea that it's not like sometimes I joke with Jennifer, my wife, because we do tend to get, critical and funny about stuff. Like, we like the Muppets, the two, Waldorf and I forget the other guys.
Dude, those are my favorite.
Right.
I love they never miss a show.
Right.
They're always there. They love the show, but that's how they do it. Please go ahead. I'm sorry, I got excited.
No, so I mean, I like that's kind of like an archetype that I really like. Like this an archetype that we feel very connected to. Like we're looking from the balcony at the show and like just talking shit about stuff. And we love doing that. With Jennifer, my wife, wherever we go, we sit in coffee shops, we steam stuff, we look at people. It's just like the human theater, like the magnitude of the human experience, the tragedy and comedy of everything, and just comment on it. But when it comes to Healing from Healing, right? Like it is to some extent that, but also it isn't just a person sitting on a balcony taking the moral high ground, like talking shit about people that don't really. It really is like very visceral to the extent that these are things that have been part of my experience and are very important for me. Yeah, like I like the honest, non-ironic, sincere drive behind it is to create, or at least to contribute towards the creation of healing spaces that are a little bit more solid, more informed, better, more politicized, like less detached from the actual realities of our collective predicaments.
Very nice. And then how do you make sure you do that in your own practice? Because you're hanging out with people, you work with clients.
Yeah.
So, and then we have people in the audience who work with clients and people who are aspiring to work with clients.
So there's been a few things that for me have been important in the last few years in terms of concepts that I recognized and then started like paying more attention to. For example, one of the things that I talk about in the page, for example, which I think is also a very important practice when it comes to working with people, is epistemic humility. Epistemology, by the way, is something that people sometimes make fun of me for being very fond of epistemic epistemology and all the different variations of this word. But epistemology basically refers kind of like to the field of inquiry, whereas we, get curious about how do we make sense about information and knowledge? How do we derive knowledge about the world and ourselves? What are the channels that we use to both acquire and process and make sense of information in order to assess something? Like the creation of knowledge, I guess, is like a good way of understanding what epistemology is. Epistemic humility, right? Like refers to the quality that we were referring to in the beginning of keeping our certainty in check. Yeah, like how do we, even if we do have beliefs about stuff or we have strong opinions about things, how do we keep a certain humility about our own fallibility? Yeah, like the idea that no matter how strongly we feel about something, we might be and probably are totally wrong about something. And, this is very true when it comes to, let's say, existential or spiritual things. Like the idea that some person or some group of people have it right when it comes to the great mystery, right? Like, it's funny, but when it comes to like other things, it can also be very important in terms of like keeping our own like working with a person, for example. Yeah, like when it comes to psychedelics, like this is very prominent. Like it's very, very, very rare that a person doesn't have a particular ontological interpretation or a worldview about what it all means. Some psychedelics perhaps more than others, but for example, the field that I've been a part of for a very long time, ayahuasca, right? Like there's such a different way of understanding this phenomena, and yet people tend to get extremely attached to their own particular way of interpreting this phenomena. Right. Like we're talking about very fundamentalist ideas about like this is the way, this is what it means because these are the plant spirits and I've been taught this by my teacher, or like these are hyperspatial intelligences that you get in touch with. The truth is that ayahuasca really is very bizarre, and DMT in general, I think, provides the kind of experiences that any level of certainty towards them starts becoming a little bit absurd. Yes. Yeah, like this is the kind of like the bottom line. If we still profess a very strong level of certainty about the sort of bizarre experiences that we can experience with DMT, ayahuasca, or any other kind of, well, not any other, but like, let's say like many other tryptamines, then it's probably a good idea to start thinking about what that means and start learning more about epistemic humility, right? And I mean, there's very interesting things that I think are very, very valuable, right? Like, for example, I mean, again, like I spent for almost 5 years in the Amazon rainforest. I apprenticed under Shipibo teachers. I did many plant dietas that are very much ingrained within a worldview, right? That has its own internal coherence. And yes, within that worldview, right, the different things that happen during your ayahuasca experience are mostly ascribed to, different forms of sentience that are the owners or the mothers of different plants. There's all sorts of different agents with agency and intentionality and, grudges and emotions and so on and so forth. And these are all really interesting, fascinating things that create a coherent worldview that people get drawn to because it provides kind of like that enchantment. There's an enchantment to the Amazonian ontologies that is very, very, very attractive to many of us who are seeking that enchantment, because most of us come from a very disenchanted. By enchantment, I mean, right, like that magic of a world that is full of agents, that is full of sentience, that is full of intentionality, that is full of intelligence, where it's not only humans utilizing objects, right, to extract things for profit, but rather one of the best descriptions of animism that I like a lot is by a scholar of religion. His name is Steve Harvey or David Harvey. I forget right now, but I can check that back. And he says, animism is basically the experience of life in a world, right, that is full of people, where there's human people, but there's also tree people and plant people and bird people and jaguar people and tapir people and all sorts of different people.
Rock people,
rain people, river people, right? Like the mineral, vegetal, animal, but also the features of nature. Like everything is sentient and intentional and has agency. Yeah. Graham Harvey, thank you. Somebody in the chat just put it. Graham Harvey. Right. And when you spend enough time in the rainforest, you start realizing that there's a very, very different way of experiencing the world. Whereas, there's another good description. I forget who it was. Barry. He said, like, animism basically is an experience of the world where the world is a community of subjects as opposed to a collection of objects.
Cool.
Right. So these two descriptions are my favorite when it comes to kind of like that animistic experience of the world, which is not so much a belief system, but rather a direct experience of an environment when you are born within that environment, within those conditions, and so on and so forth, right? So a community of subjects as opposed to a collection of objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
The experience that everything and everybody are people. And in the Amazonian ontology, like the cornerstone of Amazonian ontologies, of which there are many, probably as many as different people exist in the Amazon and different cultures exist in the Amazon, but the cornerstone of it really is that humanity is not special, in the sense that all the qualities that we oftentimes ascribe exclusively through humans in our disenchanted materialistic universe, right? Again, intentionality, agency, the capacity to feel emotions and to feel grudges and to be angry and to wish ill upon somebody else and to be joy, and the things that we exclusively ascribe to humanity. Within an Amazonian animistic worldview, these are qualities that are not exclusive to humans, but actually shared amongst all people, bird people, tree people, and so on and so forth. So the ayahuasca practices in the Amazon are, like all medical systems, are emergent from the underlying ontology. Like the ontology being the worldview, like what is the world for us? Like how do we understand the world around us? What exists in it? More importantly, who exists in it? Like who are the actors in the world? But every medical system is not separated or detached from the underlying belief system about what the world is, right? So every ayahuasca tradition in the Amazon emerges from this ontology that is enchanted, that is full of sentience, that is full of people everywhere. And hence, the interpretation of these experiences also obviously is going to draw from that imaginary, right? But there's something that happens oftentimes, and this is perhaps we're getting more into the critical aspect. I've dieted many times. I spent many hours conversing and talking with my Shipibo teachers and my Shipibo colleagues and my Shipibo friends. I have the good fortune of speaking Spanish as my primary language, even though, most Shipibos don't speak Spanish as a primary language because they speak Shipibo. I did learn a little bit of Shipibo, but Spanish is kind of enough to get, the ability to have a personal relationship with many of the people that I work with. And, like my understanding of Amazonian ontologies is such that will always be a mismatch between what I understand and what they experience. Because my understanding of this Amazonian ontology is always going to be filtered through my own conditioning. Because there's things that is very difficult to really fully get. No matter how many times you drink ayahuasca, no matter how many plant dietas you do, there's always going to be ideas or concepts that remain within the realm of ideas and concepts that for other people are not ideas or concepts, but actually fully lived experiences of what the world is like. So what happens, for example, within the complex of plant medicine in the Amazon is a lot of people kind of like adopt a sort of plant spirit shamanism discourse that becomes there's a term that I like. It becomes very Disneyfied. I like the Disneyfication of plant spirits, right?
Sure.
Which is kind of like this churning of an incredibly beautiful, diverse, complex, lived experience of animistic life into this caricature. It's a caricature that is very reductive and very, it does a disservice not only to the original people that we work with, but also it does a disservice to the people that come to our retreat center or the people that we're trying to facilitate for, because we don't really understand something, but we're making a very reductive take. And then people, like if you go to many retreat centers websites, for example, you can see like the menu that they offer, right? Like, well, we offer this particular this retreat, which is 9 days, 5 ceremonies, and then we offer this Bobin Sana diet, and Bobin Sana is a beautiful plant spirit that will help you connect with your feminine force and will help you work through your childhood trauma, because Bobin Sana is a beautiful spirit that does things. And we're already kind of like seeing the Disneyfication of the Bobin Sana, turning it from sentience, from a complex being that is, into kind of like this marketable caricature of something that might catch the attention of the person who is looking for those particular things within the complex of healing culture. Hey, I want to work through my childhood trauma. I want to connect with my feminine. So maybe Bobinsana is the plant that I want to be working with. And again, I'm not fully criticizing the whole thing. I'm just providing this as an example of how oftentimes we can
I understand that we're taking a subject and you're turning it into a reducted, it's reductive and it's objectifying,
Right.
if we're talking about a person here. To what extent is some information better than no information?
In relationship to what?
Well, like people are traveling around to work with plants and to, grow and heal and transform, and perhaps entering into a relationship with Bobinsana would be positive for all parties involved. How what's a higher level of discourse around that then? Or is it, it's like, where's the baby and where's the bathwater here?
So it's like this is a great question. It's a tricky one. There's a lot of issues, I guess, in many different levels of Western weird Western people working with different ontologies and medical systems that belong to a very different ontology. Yeah, like one of the main things, for example, would be that our understanding is radically different in all sorts of different levels.
Sure.
For example, right? Like we're seeking the traditional authenticity. This becomes a very important aspect. Like, hey, like what's the difference, for example, between me going and doing an ayahuasca ceremony in a basement, or me going and doing a ceremony in a backyard in London, or me doing a ceremony, right, with a Shipibo healer in the Amazon, right, in a retreat center that caters to Westerners, but includes within it Shipibo healers that will run the ceremonial part of it, right? There's a degree of authenticity and tradition that becomes very important for some people. This is, by the way, one of the main hooks that retreat centers use, right? Exactly to provide that unique experience, right? Like, because there's really why would people travel all the way to the Amazon instead of sitting with a local shaman in Brooklyn? But authenticity and tradition are misnomers in many ways, right? Like there's literally no way that me or you or anybody here will experience a traditional Shipibo ceremony in any way, starting with the fact that everything already has been so adapted and culturally translated to match what we need and what we want, right? I mean, the most prominent example, which I'm sure a lot of people already heard, I mean, within the Shipibo culture, as many other Amazonian cultures, right, the patient doesn't drink ayahuasca, right? If you're going to a onaya, the proper term in the Shipibo culture, onaya, which translates to the one who knows, or the one who works with uni or ayahuasca, the one who knows, right? Ayahuasca is reserved for, the shaman, the onaya.
That's what I was told once, is like when you would go, you would hope and pray that you didn't have to drink it.
Right. There's
no
shaman
reason would take care of it for you. Like it was really, you were in a bad space if you had to drink it yourself.
Right. I mean, we also have a misnomer nowadays because the medicine is now kind of become synonymous with ayahuasca. People go and have a ceremony with medicine. People seek drinking the medicine. People, I'm going to be working with medicine, right? Ayahuasca is not the medicine in the Amazon rainforest. If you ask a Shipibo Onaya, hey, what is the medicine that you work with, right? They will very, very, very forthright tell you, hey, my medicine is my song, my Icaro, right? Like the music that I sing is my medicine. The ayahuasca is a vehicle. The ayahuasca is what allows the Onaya, right, to enter into a space where they can be in communication with the different allies that they have acquired through the dieting process that help them channel the specific song that they're singing to the person. But their medicine is the music, the song, the vibration and frequency of whatever Icaro they're singing at you. That is what is healing you in the Shipibo worldview. The ayahuasca is just a vehicle. The ayahuasca is a way for the practitioner to get into the zone. Let's say I drink ayahuasca to get into the zone so I can better sing to you. But I mean, good luck filling a 24-person retreat rainforest if you're not giving ayahuasca to people.
Sure.
Who's going to and pay such amount of money just sung to? Nobody wants to be sung to. People want to drink. because we are, right, like we're not seeking necessarily the healing or the medicine, we're seeking the novelty of the experience as well.
Yes.
Very different. The novelty, two separate things oftentimes.
Well, that's even what Ram Dass said about LSD. It's like, oh, God tricked himself into paper so people could eat, so they would be interested in him.
And this is exactly a very important point, right? Because any medical system or any healing system needs to be translated. There's a cultural translation that happens that needs to be digestible and facilitate the sense making for the person, which is, again, like we're going back to the original point, which was about certainty and epistemic humility, right? If you're working with somebody who is helping you with integration, I mean, this has happened to me so many times in the last few years. People reach out to me and, hey, like I was in a retreat in the Amazon, or I work with this person and I had the horrible experience with ayahuasca, and the facilitator that was working with me told me that I was possessed by a spirit. Now, it's a whole range of different problems for the person, because not only they had a very terrifying, horrible experience with ayahuasca that will require many sessions and probably years and different therapeutic modalities to actually integrate, but now they come back home also, right? Sure and certain, because
they were possessed by demons.
They're possessed by demons,
yeah.
right? Because they have a lot of trust that this shaman, I mean, again, another one of the important aspects of ayahuasca shamanism is that oftentimes people conflate the different archetypes that we have about what an enlightened person is. And we think, oh, we have Ram Dass or different different manifestations of kind of like the Indian guru enlightened person archetype. And we kind of like superimpose that into the Amazonian ayahuasca shaman. These are two completely different archetypes. Two completely different social roles. The person that is serving you ayahuasca is not an Indian guru and is not pretending to be, right? Yeah. But people don't really understand the difference. So whatever the shaman tells them oftentimes is word of God, because this person sees through me, they're enlightened, they know exactly what's happening, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of, power dynamics embedded in there. So, epistemic humility is the kind of thing that would prevent...
And that's before you even add the suggestibility that is increased by taking the medicine.
Right.
On its own.
Exactly. So, like this is one example, for example, with epistemic humility, and, not only epistemic humility, but a very diverse toolkit for the very diverse epistemic toolkit, and a diverse toolkit for approaches would be very useful for that facilitator. So instead of saying like, hey, like wholesale, like this is what the shaman said, you're possessed by a spirit or you're possessed by a demon, and like this is what's happening to you, right? Well, hold on, let's hold back with the certainty, right? Before giving you this bomb of information that is gonna probably fuck you up for a while, and there's no real way that we can work with this in a psychological, psychotherapeutic way, because spirit possession is not really part of our culture. Like, like what would have been a better way of communicating that to the person, right? And this is a very, very, very tricky, sensitive component, because on one hand, right, like we don't want to cause damage to the person, right? Like first, cause no harm. Iatrogenic damage by ayahuasca facilitator is very, very common, right? Like iatrogenic damage. Iatrogenic is kind of like the sort of harm that comes from malpractice from a practitioner, usually a medical practitioner, where I'm adopting that now for this kind of like scenario, right? Like we don't want to cause harm or damage by instilling a seed or an idea, right, that is going to be very difficult for that person to work through. But at the same time, we don't want to misrepresent, right, what the actual onaya or the actual shaman or the actual practitioner who belongs to a very different culture is actually saying. And by the way, I never, not once have I heard a Shipibo onaya say anything about this person being possessed by a spirit or a demon or anything. This seems to be this is a very different ontology. Yeah, I mean, they do say like, oh, like, like they have they call it cupia, cutipado or cupia, which is when you piss off a plant, right? Like, oh, you cross your diet, like you did something you weren't supposed to do in your diet, so that plant, right, is making you ill for some reason, and it's a very different thing. So it's a very fine line to navigate epistemically that requires a lot of sensitivity and a lot of awareness, right? On one hand, not to cause harm to this person by putting that seed of something that's going to be very difficult for them to decolonize their minds from. But at the same time, right, like not completely disrespect or wholesale reject what actually the native explanation might be about what's happening with them. So for example, there was a not a long time ago, there was kind of like this Twitter war, mini Twitter war in the psychedelic scene, where people were debating whether psychedelic therapists needed to have experience with psychedelics themselves, right? There was a lot of people from kind of the more psychologized, institutionalized part of the psychedelic community who were saying things like, oh, well, we don't expect psychiatrists to have personal experience with clonazepam. Like, why would we expect psychedelic therapists to have experience with psychedelics, right? Which, if you take that from the specific framework of psychedelics are just as any other psychopharmaceutical thing, well, yeah, maybe there's a point. But, we know, right, that psychedelics are not just another psychopharmaceutical tool that we have. And that actually, right, there's a lot of value for the person who is treating the person to know what the fuck they're talking about based on their own personal experience, right? So, with ayahuasca, this becomes evident, because there's no way that a person can skillfully or even with the slightest degree of integrity facilitate somebody, right, who just went through a massive ayahuasca thing, if they don't have personal visceral experience of what that experience might be like, right? So this is a moment where the epistemic humility can come very handy, in the sense of having the broadest toolkit that we can have, a very deep knowledge, right? Perhaps of the local ontology that we're working within, but also of what are the tools that are available within, Western psychotherapy and all sorts of different healing modalities and all sorts of different, perhaps, very, very importantly, perhaps I think also Eastern practices, right? Like I personally very much appreciate facilitators who not only have experience working with ayahuasca, but also have a personal deep meditation practice or yoga practice. There's a whole other dimension that comes with it. And
that
having
was really interesting to me when I moved to the West Coast, because I was hanging out in a yoga community, and yoga communities have their own issues, and we were talking about conflating shamans with gurus and things like that. And in yoga you would see things like, if somebody was able to get their body into advanced postures, that meant they were more enlightened.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Which is absurd. But one of the nice things about that community is that people did do their practice. Like, people showed up and they were on their mat and they were, on their cushion, and they were doing their practice. And sometimes it entrenched their egos more. But for the most part, you would find the people who you felt like were sincere, and you would be friends. I would be friends with them, and we would do our work. And and then maybe there were some there were psychedelics mixed in whenever they were. And then finding a community where people were just getting downloads, and there wasn't any personal practice,
right?
And there wasn't really any kind of satsang or any kind of group accountability, or sweating it out in any way. There was just sort of like, I had a download, and everybody would be like, congratulations, I had a download too. And there was a lot of patting each other on the back for how many downloads that everybody had collected. And so when you say that, it's nice, and when you look at, Janice Phelps's work, or Bill Richards, what things that these people say about what makes a good facilitator, it's an understanding of these kinds of complementary practices.
Right. I mean, the download, I think it's also a good example of epistemic humility, right? Like we can be attuned to our intuition, and we can be receptive to extrasensory information, or all sorts of different ways that we can pick up on ideas and so on and so forth. But at the same time, kind of being self-aware and skeptical. There's kind of like this. There's this good good saying, right? Like, don't believe everything that you think.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Don't believe everything that you think can be extrapolated to a lot of these situations. And when it's not, then right, like we get into these things where every download is universal truth, or every ayahuasca experience, right, is like, oh, Mother Ayahuasca showed me this, so this has to be universal truth for me and for everybody else, because Mother Ayahuasca is not wrong, right? Like this comes from a higher level of knowledge, a higher plane of being, or the spirits, or God, or whoever you want to position as that authority on experience, right? Yeah, so intuition is that kind of like one tricky thing that on one hand we don't want to fully reject, obviously, but at the same time kind of like keeping that self-reflective critical stance that yeah, I mean, these things are not infallible, and oftentimes they are also bullshit.
Yeah.
Broad toolkits.
Somebody said, I'm getting mixed messages. Do I drink the ayahuasca or don't I?
I mean, that's a very good question, because I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, like I wouldn't have thought about it for 1 second, and I would have said yes. I think now I'm a little bit more careful when it comes to psychedelic ayahuasca in particular. Should you drink it? I mean, this is a conversation that would examine many different parameters in terms of intention, need, context. Like, for example, one of the things that nowadays I'm very careful with when I'm working with somebody in a preparation process is to assess the social support system that they have.
Right.
Yeah, like that back in the day, I didn't think that was a huge thing. But nowadays, I would be very, very careful of sending somebody to drink ayahuasca 7 times in a retreat center if I knew that they were coming home and they were on their own and didn't really have friends or family to support them through the integration part. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster in my view nowadays.
Yeah,
right?
I've had those clients come, that have no support where they live. I was talking to somebody just the other day. They were looking for somebody to work with somebody who had very, very destabilizing experiences, and their shaman said, oh, what you have to do about that is drink more ayahuasca.
Yeah.
It's like, you got to like push right through that, and drink ayahuasca till you get to the other side. And that's horrifying to me. And maybe that's my own bias, but I don't see any reason. Well, the things are intense enough. I don't see any reason not to be gentle.
Yeah.
While you're doing the intense things.
Absolutely. I mean, I have had experiences like that in the jungle that didn't turn out well, right? Like facilitators who really push people to, push through. There's 2 particular cases. I mean, I haven't really. No, I mean, like I can't obviously go much into detail, but there was 2 particular cases where people did end up in psychiatric care and the very delicate situations, and a big part of that was facilitators didn't know to stop in time, right? So there's kind of like this idea that is also very prevalent in the circles, right? Oh, you had a bad experience, or you had a couple of like difficult ones, but there's an innate intelligence. The plant knows what it's doing with you, right? Spirit knows how to work with you, right? Just keep going, push through, right? There isn't really any critical component to, oh, well, perhaps these are actually red flags that this is not the right thing for you right now. No, right? One of the taglines in the place that I used to work with, right? Like, ayahuasca knows exactly why you're here and what it is that you need. So if you tell a person that, right, hey, and the person believes it, hey, ayahuasca knows exactly why you're here and what it is that you need, then that can become very tricky, particularly in situations like that where perhaps not drinking anymore and doing something else might be more appropriate than pushing through 7 ceremonies and ending up in psychiatric care.
Right. The old trust the process.
Trust the process.
Yeah. It's got a very, and it has kind of like one of those faith healer Christian Science kind of aspects to it.
Totally.
Where it's just like, put your faith in the thing.
Yeah, I mean, a huge a huge part of the plant medicine world is very, very much based on the template of faith healing.
Yeah.
This is something that is there's very much true. And again, like it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think it requires a degree of awareness that that's what's happening, and then also a degree of self-reflectiveness.
Yeah.
But faith is important for sure.
Yeah. And so how do we, so, we talked about deep humility, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the part of, a service provider, a healing artist, as it were. Where is the role, as Tanisha brought up, how do we keep our critical thinking tuned? Like, how do we find the balance of like opening our heart, surrendering what needs to be surrendered, letting go of stuff that's holding us back, being open to love, all of these things that are, I think are great. All of those things I just listed are like my favorite things in the world.
Yeah.
But doing that with a certain amount of like critical thinking, self-awareness, and the like.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that was massively lacking. One of the main reasons why I thought this would be a good idea to start that page. And right, like one of the main messages that I get a lot of messages on my page, but one of the more recurrent messages is like, thank you for doing this, because I haven't found this thing in other places, and I was really needing this. Or sometimes, for example, I get like, oh, I wish I had found your page 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago when I was going through my ego inflation messianic phase, for example, right? One of the things actually that
throw
I
a
do
one in the chat if you've gone through a messianic phase.
Yeah, I mean, this is extremely common. I would say
Yeah.
this is par for the course. I mean, are you going through an ego inflation messianic phase? Fine, great. It means that you are on the path. The only problem is, right, like, well, you have to continue on the path, and you need people to kind of like rein you in and say like, hey, don't take yourself too seriously. Don't take your ideas too seriously. Don't try to start a fucking cult right now. This is not the fucking point. Don't open a retreat center right now because you're still on the path, right? Like the amount of retreats in the Amazon that have sprung up because somebody in the messianic phase took themselves too seriously and also happen to have the resources available. I mean, I would say like I'm not going to throw numbers. I would say maybe half of the retreat centers in the Amazon have an origin story that is something like that, right? Like, oh, I went to the Amazon feeling really shitty about myself because all these things were happening. I drank ayahuasca. Ayahuasca saved my life, and it gave me a mission to share the medicine with the world. Standard. Really, like every other ayahuasca center has the same. And again, like, it's not necessarily something bad. Yeah, I mean, I do think that people do get obviously a lot of benefit from it, and they have the calling to share that with the world. But again, there is a progression, I guess, to the psychedelic spirituality that does include many phases of like big, messianic impetu and ego inflation, and so on.
Aviva, right?
Aviva.
Does she have like a play kitchen?
She doesn't have a play kitchen yet.
Does she have like like a little playhouse or some kind of thing like that?
Yeah.
We need like a play school baby's first retreat center for grown-ups.
Right. That's a great idea. And
like can get that out of their system.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a great thing. And that's actually, like, not a crazy idea. And that's actually, I think, the main reason why things like ayahuasca, right, were always embedded within mystery schools. Yeah, like there's a big reason why throughout history people didn't just go on Instagram and found a Kabbalah webpage and started learning Kabbalah without any, supervision or guidance, or like people. I like the Jewish mystery tradition for the first time in my life after many years of fumbling around all sorts of different things. But traditionally, if you wanted to find a Kabbalah master, then there were all sorts of different requirements that you needed to fulfill, right? Like traditionally, well, I mean, not all of them are actually very aligned with our modern zeitgeist, right? Because for one, you need to be a man. I don't think that,
Oh, right. You have to be over 40. Because I remember being like 16 and wanting to learn it and being like, I have to wait till I'm 40. And like, we blew right past that quick.
Right. So traditionally, at least in the Kabbalistic traditions. I imagine there were many, but there were like three main ones, right? Like you need to be a man, you need to be male, but also you needed to be over 40, and you need to be a father. Like you need to have kids, right? Like these were kind of like the three.
We're in.
Right. We are. Well, when I was younger, I was like, oh, like that's stupid. Like, why the fuck? I mean, I'm 20, I know everything about the world, and I'm thirsty for knowledge and initiations, and I wanna do all the things and experience all the experiences, and that. Now that I am nearing 40 and I have all this experience, I can like start understanding more in depth why mystery traditions, mystery schools, different mystical, lineages had kind of like these bars that you needed to clear first before you were I mean, the idea of initiation, right? Like, what is an initiation? An initiation entails that in order to acquire this knowledge or to go through this experience, you need to be initiated in it, which requires that somebody vouches that you're worthy or ready to do so, right? There's a urban legend, which is not very accurate, but there's an urban legend that says that ayahuasca was forbidden to be shared with Westerners up until very recently being, the mid 90s or the early 2000s, where ayahuasca started globalizing exponentially, right? And this is a story that I've heard many, many times from all sorts of different people. They said, oh, yeah, like, ayahuasca was a heavily guarded secret in the Amazon rainforest and nobody had access to it. And the few people that tried ayahuasca before the, millennium were people that were chosen by the shamans of their tribes. And and more so, like apparently there was a council of indigenous people in the late 90s who consulted with the plants, and then they were given the directive that it was time to share ayahuasca with Western brothers and sisters because our survival on this planet was dependent on it, which is another one of the cornerstones of the modern plant medicine messianism, right? Like ayahuasca is going to save the world. Yeah, I mean, again, like, I don't know what the origin of that urban legend is. I have heard it from all sorts of different people. I have asked many of my Shipibo colleagues and teachers, and they have no idea what I'm talking about.
Seems like an easy story to invent.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to do, obviously, with all sorts of different global processes, such as globalization, right? Like global mobility increased massively during the last 20 years. The capacity of people to fly to the Amazon rainforest and have access, to ayahuasca is something that wasn't so even in the 90s or the early 2000s for all sorts of different reasons of, neoliberal globalization reasons and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, the idea of initiation, right? That there's a level of maturity that is needed and expected from a person before certain mysteries are revealed to them. And the idea of the mystery school, I think, is something that actually can be very useful moving forward as a way to actually regulate to some extent the sort of experiences people have and at what stages of their development. I mean, do we want to do we accept messianism and ego inflation as an inevitable aspect of every person's journey, or do we actually understand that there's something immature, right, about people who early on in their lives go through these massive experiences that will cause, this deep imbalance in their own self-perception, in their own sense of self-importance, in their own appraisal, right, of how much they actually understand versus how little they actually understand, right? So, I think there are many ways. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is we started our conversation talking about how people were very self-centered, that the greatest thing that I can do is work on myself. Whereas, and then on the flips, so that's one thing, the spiritual narcissism. It seems that at the other extreme is the messianism, where it's like, I'm going to save everybody. And so, where in the middle, like, how do we, because some of that, is like some of that ideation, that self-aggrandizement it comes out of like, I'm good enough to make a difference. Like I there's something worthwhile in me that can be leveraged for the benefit of others, right? I
Yeah,
just can't take it too far. And again, to quote Ram Dass again, because that's what I got. You got to realize everybody else is God too. And so there's a certain humility in that, to be one God among many.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Jesus delusion is not anything new, right? Like this is kind of like a standard feature in pretty much any psych world all over the world. There's
and it affects different people to different degrees. Some people's messianic complex is just lasts for 3 hours, and then they come down and they go to breakfast, and it's wasn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah,
some people it might stick.
This would be probably a good field for actual empirical research, or at least an observational study. But I would venture to think that within the ayahuasca communities, this is probably much more prevalent than in other, definitely against baseline, but also definitely maybe against other psychedelic uses. And I think a lot of that has to do with the narrative that is underlying. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is set and setting when it comes to psychedelic use, but not kind of like the traditional part of setting, but rather a component of setting that I find not many people actually focus on a lot, which is not necessarily like what my immediate surrounding looks like, what is the ceremonial design like, do I have candles or the right kind of music, but the part of setting that relates to the kinds of stories that we're telling each other about what is going to happen.
Yeah.
Like, what is this experience going to be like? What is this for? What is ayahuasca for? Right? Like the experiences of people are, and this is actually, it is part of my research, but the experiences of people, or I mean, maybe not the experience themselves, but the way that people sense make and meaning make their experiences is greatly dependent on what was the story that we were told about what ayahuasca is for. Right. So like the story part, the component of the setting that is conceptual, that is the stories that we tell about things, is something that definitely requires much more attention that is given out, because right now it is not given that much attention, right? So for example, one of the examples that I have, the place that I used to work in is very much Shipibo based in terms of the ceremonial design, and the ayahuasca part of it is run by Shipibo people, and it's not traditional in any sense, obviously, because it's for Westerners, but it's run, let's say, in a Shipibo inspired manner by Shipibo practitioners. But if you listen to the facilitators before a retreat center, if you go to the website, or all the communications about what ayahuasca is for, right? The main component of it almost always is ayahuasca will help you heal your childhood trauma. The childhood trauma part of it becomes very central.
Yeah.
Right. So I have had, for example, when I was facilitating there, I have had a few instances where I have, for example, one person who I facilitated a retreat for, who was there for 7 ceremonies. And the first ceremony, he had this massive, incredible, beautiful, metaphysical, transpersonal experience. The second ceremony, this beautiful relational thing when he forgave his father or her mother, like this beautiful come together, MDMA-like, heartwarming thing. Then the third ceremony, again, some sort of like transpersonal, mystical encounter with the divine and experiences of awe. And, it went on for like 7 ceremonies. And then we came up to the closing circle. And, and after each ceremony, like this person came and talked to me and like, oh, like this ceremony and this happened and that happened. And then we had the closing circle. And then, when this person's turn comes up, he shares with the group that he's very disappointed. Right. And I'm like, well, how come you're disappointed? Because, we spoke about your ceremonies and, you had this incredible, yes, but before I came here, I was told that ayahuasca was going to help me figure out my childhood trauma. And I didn't have any of that. Right. So we got into a situation where this person went through like probably 7 of the most mind-blowing experiences of their own life. And yet they're living very disappointed because they didn't get what they came to get, because they were told repeatedly right? That the intention of working with ayahuasca was 100% that ayahuasca was going to help you identify and work through your childhood trauma, because childhood trauma is the source of every and any adult dysfunction that you might experience. This is like an extreme example, but it's something that happens repeatedly.
Sure.
We tell people what this is for, and then we kind of like blind them to the actual magnitude of the other things that they're already experiencing that might have been life-changing or probably are in different ways.
Yeah, that is so true.
You know, I mean, I'm not saying that ayahuasca cannot be helpful with childhood trauma.
I get that. It's just preloading all of these expectations. Like the expectation management is off.
Yeah. Totally.
And then not only that, I mean, there's the expectation management at the center is off, but then also the story that is so popular these days around childhood trauma being the source of, you know, this kind of vague, unverifiable thing where there's always more of it to deal with. You know, we get, you know, the perinatal matrices. Oh, this happened to you during the birth process. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very you know, important aspect, because this is central to modern psychedelic culture, and this is central to modern healing culture, right? Like the influence that, you know, thinkers and practitioners like Peter Levine and Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, right, in our understanding of kind of like within this niche of psychedelic healing culture. I mean, the understanding that trauma really is the central component or the only original source of every and any adult dysfunction is very much ingrained in these things. And again, like it's tricky. It's a tricky thing to navigate when we are in that space. I mean, one of the trickier things that actually, you know, I think now a little bit more people are becoming more aware of this and writing about it. But I have many instances which, you know, as an integration facilitator, this is something that people will have to deal with, right? Like, you know, like ayahuasca. You know, people will drink ayahuasca or any other psychedelic, and they will have, you know, visions or experiences of sexual trauma, sexual assault. Sometimes they're vague, sometimes they're clear, sometimes they're very straightforward, but 90% of the time they aren't, right? They're very fuzzy, they're very nebulous, like it's very difficult to make sense of them. Again, epistemic humility. We come to a facilitator who is very much oriented towards trauma work and trauma informed and so on and so forth. Like, you know, this definitely happened, like this event definitely. Sometimes people will come like, hey, like, you know, I even saw like images, perhaps my uncle, but I can't be sure. It's very fuzzy, you know, like there's a degree of maybe, but who knows, right? That is very important for facilitators to be extremely careful in navigating those instances. I mean, now the idea, right, that ayahuasca will show you literal instances of things that happened to you when you were a child is very tricky to navigate. Within psychology nowadays, right, there is an ongoing debate that has spanned decades. There's nothing new about the validity of techniques that are meant or supposed to be used for recovering suppressed and repressed memories. And this even without getting into, you know, the validity of psychoanalytic concepts as repression and suppression, which are also, right, like in doubt in many other ways. Well, let's say when it comes to trauma, right, this is a very tricky thing. So, you know, there is a big debate that has spanned decades. I mean, is this a valid way? Is it any tools or techniques are valid to really make sense of recovering memories from childhood, or are these just confabulations, or are these just, you know, and when it comes to ayahuasca, this seems to be a primary orientation that many people are seeking and many people are giving, and facilitators will need in many instances to be able to navigate. Hey, I mean, do we take this literally? If I say, hey, like, let's not take this literally and explore other options. Are they gonna be feeling like I'm gaslighting them? Like I'm not taking the trauma seriously? Like I mean, it's a very tricky thing, right? And yet it is very important, in my opinion, that we do have this awareness that, hey, ayahuasca very rarely will show you literal things that happen in your childhood. Very rarely will show you literal things at all. I mean, this is a highly symbolic, highly Jungian, highly archetypal, chaotic, entropic language, if we can call it language at all, right?
Yes.
the point with trauma, I think it is a central one, because I have had to, to work with a lot of people who were, like really stressed about this particular thing. It's like, like there were two particular instances where ayahuasca kind of like showed a very literal image of a particular family member, but they didn't really have a recollection of anything happening, and they didn't really have like a strong feeling either way. It's like, oh, this is weird. I mean, that
Right.
person, like I never, right?
Yeah, and
And
then
then like,
we sometimes even have people going back in. They got a whisper of a hint that something might have happened, and now the intention becomes, I'm going to go get more information about
right,
that, which is really tricky.
it is tricky.
You're reminding me, there's I work with people a lot to take the symbols of their visions and work together to extrapolate meaning from
Yeah,
them. There was one woman, and this is back when I was doing memes on Instagram, and maybe we can spend a little time with memes before we close.
let's do that.
But this woman reached out and she said, I had a vision and I know it was real. And I was like, cool, tell me about it. Jared Leto came to me. Do you know Jared Leto?
Yeah,
He said that when I prepared myself spiritually, when I was ready and I purified myself enough and prepared myself enough, he was going to come and get me, and we were going to go off and be together forever. And I asked her, is it possible that this is symbolic of something? Nope.
yeah,
Nope, this
yeah,
is real.
yeah,
And you look at you study communication, amongst people, and people talking to each other in English face to face in the same room with each other sometimes only pick up like 70 to 80% of what the other person is saying at any given time. Like, we barely understand each other when we're talking. The idea that we're going to have actual and so, like, even if you're having psychic communication with Jared Leto, like, the chances that you're getting everything right are very slim,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
there's so many reasons why, I just choose to err on the side of, like, how about a little dream interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, I had a person once in an ayahuasca retreat. This is probably 2017, so it was very shortly after Trump was elected, I think. And I had a person who, yeah, like a woman from New York who had a full blown experience of Donald Trump being the Messiah and the savior of humanity, and it was very difficult to move her from her. And obviously, like in deeper inspection of where that belief system comes from,
Was
then
she from Austin?
I don't think she's from New York.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like you start digging a little bit deeper, and obviously you start kind of getting to the scaffolding for these kinds of experiences, right?
Yeah.
Like the political beliefs, the kind of media they're consuming. And again, like it wasn't like a matter like, oh, like you're wrong or anything like it. It was just like the degree of certainty. Again, we go back to the epistemic humility of degree of certainty that sometimes people will profess after they have, and it makes sense, right? Like whoever has had like the sort of ayahuasca, like ceremony or any sort of psychedelic experience where there's kind of like this very intense, clear download of knowledge. Like this is, like it's very difficult to not, attach your whole, to put all the eggs in that basket. It really,
Yes.
again, like it really does require. My friends, good friends of mine from Imperial College, Chris Timmerman and Russ Watts and David Dupuy, they wrote this beautiful paper maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. They called it the need for psychedelic apprenticeship, right? And Chris has been leading kind of like the psilocybin and DMT studies at Imperial College, and Russ for many years has been also like the lead for the clinical studies, and then a few other things. But like the paper that they wrote basically was something along the lines, right, of how do we create a culture of apprenticeship within psychedelic circles where people are going into it with not only a beginner's mind, but with the epistemic humility that it takes to understand that no matter what the plants show us, or no matter what we see, or no matter what we experience, right, there has to be first and foremost a mentality of skepticism, right? Like a mentality of apprenticing, a mentality of like studentship, a mentality that, hey, you know, it will take years upon years upon years to be able, and even then, like who the fuck knows, you know, but even to like just be able to make sense of this experience in a way that is grounded, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we started off talking about not knowing
Not
and the
knowing.
comfort in that. And I'm
Yeah.
reminded of Robert Anton Wilson had that, you know,
Right.
he had his own school called the Maybe Logic Academy.
Yeah, love Robert.
And I just think, you know, there's so much power in the phrase maybe,
Yeah,
you know, Donald Trump is a light worker, maybe, you know,
maybe.
what are like, yeah, a few other ways of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. I think, you know, it's a very simple thing, but really a very good antidote for the sort of certainty that can become very difficult then, you know, for the person and also for other people around that person. The stuff that, you know, cults are made of. Yeah, certainty. Well, and
Um,
power.
yeah. So you were telling me that sometimes you feel like hanging up your meme making apps.
Yeah. I mean, you know, more than anything, just when it comes to healing from healing, again, like, you know, we started saying that it's a very imperfect experiment.
Yeah.
And I, you know, like when I started, again, like when I started healing from healing, it was a very personal thing.
Yeah.
And then, you know, as I started growing, obviously, I started getting input from people. You know, there's this phenomenon that happens, which is called audience capture, right?
Mm.
Audience capture and dopamine captures are things that are
Yes.
very real in social media.
Sure.
And very early on, I started realizing that, you know, I was not immune to it. I mean, not by a mile,
Yeah.
right? That I started like really calibrating some of my posts and some of the things that I would write, not necessarily to what I thought was in full integrity or the message that I wanted to put out, but rather what I thought would land well with people, right?
Right.
What would give engagement, what would give likes, what were the kinds of things that people wanted to see, which is not necessarily, I mean, what people want to see is not necessarily the thing that I want to say, right? Like there's
Right.
always kind of like that dissonance. Do I say this thing even though I know it's not gonna be the most liked thing in the history of the thing? You know, and the dopamine capture, which is also a very real thing. Yeah, like the frailty, the fragility of the human brain, particularly as we interact with the
Yes.
sort of exponential technologies that provide us with stimuli that we're not prepared to handle in any way, in a healthy way, right? I mean, we're literally Paleolithic creatures in an endless buffet of sugar and fat all the time,
Yes.
right? Like our bodies, our bodies haven't evolved ever since, you know, our ancestors were like really optimizing for the sugar and the piece of fat that would make them alive. And this is true not only for food, this is true for anything that provides us the kind of rewards that you get from the dopaminergic boost. Social media is one of the easiest, right?
Yes.
If you hit a vein and you start getting the likes and you start getting the responses that trigger that dopaminergic response, then it's very difficult to not want that. It's very difficult to not go for the sugary, fatty, you know, delicious thing that you know maybe is not the best for you, but nonetheless will provide the push, right? Like all the fireworks going in the head. It's very difficult. I mean, you know, I I didn't really have personal experience of what that was like because I mean, again, I'm talking as if I'm, you know, like a global influencer of something, which I'm not. But there is a degree of
There's probably
engagement,
there are people from other countries here tonight. You're global.
right? Yeah, I mean, there's a following, there's
You're no
engagement,
Jared Leto, but you know, you're doing okay.
right? I mean, I don't know him personally, but I know of him. Which again, like, another thing that is worth mentioning is the parasocial nature of social media, which is a
Right.
whole other clusterfuck by its own. Like
Yes.
the illusion of relationship, the illusion of relation to the influencer or the person behind the screen, and the forgetfulness that actually we don't know these people. Jared Leto, like I don't know Jared Leto. I know of him because I've seen him in some. when I was a kid, right, like I loved sitcoms, and I remember like watching Friends, and I was young. I was maybe 16 or 17 or 15, like around high school, and I remember like, I had an incredible good fortune of like really having a very strong group friend. Like I grew up with like a little tribe, strong relationships, male and female, like very healthy, very solid. But I remember like, like watching Friends, and at some point like realizing like, oh, like I'm attached to these
These people, right?
characters. Like I care about Rachel, right? Like I care what happens to Phoebe. I mean, Phoebe, she wasn't my favorite within the, but like when Friends was when Seinfeld was canceled, man, like when I saw the last episode of Seinfeld in my neighbor's house, it was like 5 a.m. because I was living in Israel, which is the other side of the world, but they broadcast the last episode of Seinfeld live, and I remember like when it ended, I was like in tears, right? Like, oh, like I'm not gonna hang out in Jerry's apartment anymore. Like I'm not gonna hear Kramer barging into the parasocial last. So this is kind of like a 90s sitcom experience of parasocial relationships. But nowadays with social media, right? Like the parasocial relationships that we form with influencers and content creators, and I mean it's really, really, really nuts. And it's nuts mostly because it provides a cheap simulacra of relationship that is not really real, right? We are living through probably one of the biggest epidemics of our times, right? It's not I mean, with all the respect, yeah, to viruses and so, but like the real, in my opinion, and the opinion of many social public health and global health experts, the biggest epidemics ravaging many westernized countries really is loneliness, alienation, right? Like the unraveling of the social fabric of community in most of the Western world. I mean, I was looking at numbers the other day. I think I was like 40 to 50% of adult men in the United States have one or two close friends, and then almost I think it was 15 or 20% of grown adult men in the United States don't have one close friend, right? Like the dissolution of the sense of shared togetherness, of communal life, like the hyper individualistic ethos. I mean, this is, I think, like the biggest and most important contributor to suffering, psychic suffering, mental illness, mental suffering in every way and form, from depression to anxiety to everything else. Is just sheer alienation and loneliness, right? So social media provide that was a preamble. Social media provides kind of like that simulacra oftentimes of like, hey, like I feel, like I'm connected to people, like I have friends, but it doesn't really. It's like like aspartame, right? Like stevia, like it sort of feels sweet, but it's not quite it. So this is something that I do kind of like try to meet it. Well, I mean, I started talking about something else, and then I just went to loneliness because that's the thing that I'm most passionate about. Actually, like the majority of my research, the thing that I really, the whole doctoral dissertation that I'm writing now is pretty much based on the premise, right? That the big thing that people struggle with in general is loneliness and alienation, and that plant medicines, at least ayahuasca, is in its essence a relational medicine. That the main thing that I found helps people is not the metaphysical things or even the psychoanalytic ones or the psychological, but actually like they go to a retreat, and for the first time in their lives, for many people, they found a sense of shared togetherness, right? Like the group that they drink with, the experiences that they had together, even if it's very short, 12 days, 14 days, whatever it is. But a lot, this is not, I'm not just pulling this out of my ass. I did hundreds of interviews with people, and one of the main themes that almost all comes up when I ask a very simple question, like, "Hey, what was the most beneficial, or what were the things that you find the most healing during the whole retreat?" Right? And oftentimes it was the relationships that I made, the people that I met, the experiences that we had together, that sense of shared togetherness, of mutual responsibility for each other, of remembering that my well-being and your well-being are intimately connected to each other, that nobody can be fully happy and healthy unless we're all healthy and happy, right? And this is kind of like one of the conditions that a retreat brings together very nicely, right? Like the people that come from different parts of the world and they're all struggling with different things, but ultimately the sharing groups are very powerful in the sense that we find sometimes that our suffering doesn't have to remain private, that other people are going through similar things. So yeah, the relational aspect of all of this work, I think, is and will remain primary, precisely because that's the thing that many of us are so thirsty for, even if we don't really acknowledge it or are aware of it to begin with. Alienation, loneliness, and so on and so forth. And going back to the social media component, we started talking about the not necessarily the parasocial relationship of it, but kind of just like the junk food that it entails. Like the dopamine hits, the parasocial relationships being part of kind of like the cheap substitute that is just a simulacra of something else that we're really craving, which is actual relationships, actual community. But yeah, as the page has grown, my feelings about it also have changed a lot throughout the last few months. And I would be lying if I said that I was 100% happy with it or proud of what I do and so on. There's many times where I'm not. I think, like I do thread a very thin line sometimes between criticism and skepticism. And sometimes also like being mean or ridiculing certain things, which is something that I never intend to do. But I'm not very good at it sometimes. And I do sometimes, like fuck it up. I haven't had many instances where somebody like really reached out to me and was like, hey, like this thing that you posted was really hurtful or harmful. But I do sometimes, and this is something that we were talking about before, right? Like the difference with punching up and punching down, which is something that I have been learning more and more.
Well, can I just take, that I used to meme.
Right.
And I gave it up.
Right.
Like I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Like my heart just, at some point, like my heart wasn't in it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't feeling good about it anymore. And I was making things.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it and I was like, I don't want to post that. Like, I don't like, that's not, it was an energy. There was an energy starting to come. Either I changed or what was coming through was changing. And I couldn't channel it anymore. And I was like, there's got to be a different way to add to the conversation. And interestingly enough, the feedback that started coming back changed too. Right. So it's like, I would go to a conference or something like that, and people would want to like argue with me about the memes. People, they would be intense and it would be heavy, or worse, somebody would want to show me their memes and they were always terrible. Meming is harder than it looks, I think, and you're very good at it. But I shifted to a different way of approaching, the whole thing. And I like it. It's like I'm getting a lot of people who tell me they were having a bad trip and they went to my page and it helped.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I get that.
So I just want to say, like, if you felt like you wanted to shift, I would get it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, this is a complex thing. On one hand, yes, then I definitely don't want to be known, right, as the person who makes fun of people or the person who ridicules people. And that's never the intention. And also, I don't think that's the main vibe that most people get from it, even though sometimes, obviously, I do put out things that are very cringy, but not necessarily to, point at the person and say like, oh, look, how cringy this video is or this thing is, but rather like they oftentimes tell a story. Right? I almost never post one thing just to focus on that one thing, but I almost post kind of like a gallery that has a storytelling or a narrative to it, which, like the idea is to maybe use individual examples to tell a story or to illuminate a certain structure that needs to be illuminated. That being said, yes, I mean, sometimes it will come off as mean or, ridiculing and so on. And this is something that whenever that happens, I honestly don't, I never feel good about it. So for me, it's always kind of like been a dialectic. And I guess like also a process of trying to understand kindness. What does being kind means, right? Like there's kind of like this beautiful concept of fierce compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like fierce compassion. Like what is kindness? What is kindness? Is kindness always being kind in a, kind of like straight going forward way, like, like being kind in the sense of like not
gentle.
right. But then I think like, well, what is the intention, right, behind these things? Is it really just like getting a kick out of like ridiculing one thing, or getting a kick out of like making fun of that one person? Like, no, there's an intention here, right? Which, whether I do it well or not, I have no idea. And I'm sure that sometimes I'm gonna fuck up, and fail at it. But the intention always is kind of like show something, right, that can be better in certain ways that are not about that person that right there, but are the structures, right? To illuminate a way of thinking, to illuminate a pattern, right, that is prevalent or prominent within these subcultures, right, that will hopefully contribute towards making things better in the long run, right? So in my perspective, sometimes like punctual individual kindness in a moment can be sacrificed for the sake of something else that is more structural, that is more all-encompassing. And that's, maybe that's only my own like messianic ego inflation, that I allow myself to make fun of these things because I think and I know differently of how people should act. But, like the thing is like, also like, I try to not be prescriptive but descriptive, in the sense that I'm not necessarily telling people how things should be better, but just trying to kind of like use my storytelling skills, if there's any of them to be had, to illuminate a certain story and let people reach their own conclusions, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes, for example, within a gallery of 10 videos or 10 images, right, there's going to be a mix of different things. There's going to be some things that are straightforward, cringy, and stupid and ridiculous. There's going to be something that actually I find to be sincere, that I find to be beautiful and inspiring. And there's going to be something, that is kind of like threading the line between those two, in my opinion, right? And then sometimes, one of the kind of like more common responses from people will be like, oh, like, what is slide 6 doing in this gallery? That's actually, a person that I respect, and this is a good take. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, again, like, I'm not spoon feeding anybody what I think is good and bad, but I'm telling a story, yeah, that illuminates the use of common themes or the use of common aspects or certain approaches, so people can make their own minds and come to their own conclusions about this particular topic. And I think, I guess for the most part, it's somewhat successful because people do resonate with it for the, sometimes I, there has been one post in the history of my page that I had to take down because people just,
What was it?
I mean, I don't know if you remember, maybe like 3 months ago, there was this incident of a woman who was in a plane, and
she saw a lizard person.
Right, she saw a lizard person.
That woman's an American hero. She should be protected at all costs.
Right. So I put up a post. There were 10 slides with all sorts of different remixes and memes, and the original video of the woman in the plane, like having a, whatever experience she was having in that moment, which, by the way, like I saw a couple of weeks ago, she kind of like made, after being missing for months, she kind of like came up to the light and apologized for the incident. And she didn't really explain anything, I mean, she didn't really explain what happened, but she, she came forward and so on. But, I thought that it was funny, but also I thought that the main narrative at the time that I was working with, which was kind of like the main narrative that I was seeing from all the different sources that I was able to find about this particular incident, was that this woman thought that the person that was sitting next to her was, right, like a reptilian or an NPC or some sort of like dehumanized, less than human character in the multiverse, and that she felt that she needed to get off that plane and also, alert the other people, who is very much on brand of the things that I talk about, because I do try to point out that some of the narratives within healing culture, and more so than healing culture, conspiracy epistemics, are very dehumanizing, because they're almost always kind of like imply a hierarchy of the real people versus the NPCs or the reptilians, and
right,
so that was kind of like the main gist of it. But a lot of people took that incident not necessarily in that way, but rather as that person was having a very public mental health incident, right? Like a mental health episode. As she was going through a, psychological thing or a psychotic break, or she was having some sort of thing, right, that was not cool to laugh about publicly, which I get, right? I mean, if I knew that that person was really going through a mental health episode, or she was going through like a, you know, I mean, these things intertwine a lot. It was tricky. But anyway, a lot of people felt that it was not cool and it was not appropriate. And for, you know, the one and first and only time that I actually, you know what, for the benefit of the doubt, because we don't know what that person was going through, and we don't know what that person was, and more importantly, because this wasn't content that she herself uploaded, but rather something that somebody else filmed, even though it was a public space, and filming people in public spaces is fair game to the best of my ethical and moral compass. I took it down and then apologized for it.
Right. Well, that was good navigating your personal ethics. Yeah. And
I don't know. Yeah, I mean,
that?
I don't know, but I don't know, but you know, I don't know if it was right or wrong. I mean, I think it was all over the internet, but I felt that perhaps for the sort of,
you just are navigating for you.
Right, exactly.
You're not responsible for the whole internet.
No, but yeah, I mean, you know,
for you.
Just in terms of kind of like the, I guess just in terms of what I want the page to be and the kind of tone and messaging that I want it to be, right? Like, again, I don't want it to be the sort of place where people might feel like somebody who is having a mental breakdown or a psychiatric episode is being laughed at. Like, that was kind of like the part of it, right? Particularly when that person didn't post that to the internet. I think, like, you know, if a person chooses to post something on their own, then it's fair game.
You know, and it's interesting because you're talking about this acute episode, but we have been talking about people posturing in certain ways, like people with messiah complexes,
right,
who are, you know, that there's this kind of chronic mental health issue, that is sort of, you know, is getting a pretty big vote in the space.
So I mean, again, like this is kind of like the punching up versus punching down, right? Like I do try to make sure most of the times, I'm not always good with it, but most of the times I do try to make sure that if there is a video that I'm posting that is, you know, very clearly meant to elicit a reaction of cringe or ridicule or, oh, like this is wrong, or, you know, antagonism to some extent, right? That, you know, it is a person who is not just, you know, a young person who just had their first trip and is like very clearly in this process of figuring things out, right? That, you know, perhaps this person doesn't need the ridicule, but they need a little bit more of guidance or a bit more structure. But rather, like, you know, people that seem to be, you know, higher up the ladder in terms of influence, in terms of power, people that are misusing their influence for things that perhaps, you know, are, I feel, and other people feel.
You mentioned Aaron Rodgers.
Right. So Aaron Rodgers, you know, again, like these are very tricky things because people have very strong feelings about these things.
People are very protective about their celebrities.
Yeah, and because of the topic,
because of the power relationships. Yes,
but also because the main point with Aaron Rodgers is that he lied about being vaccinated, right? So he kind of like the whole pot was stirred because he pretended like he was vaccinated when in fact he wasn't. He was immunized. I mean, he claimed he was immunized, and then you know, people felt it wasn't fair because the whole NFL kind of like stopped for a very long time, and, you know, one of the conditions to continue was that people were vaccinated. And anything that has to do with vaccines is already going to be explosive and inflammatory, and I don't personally like to get into this spots because I also you know, there's many things that I'm ambivalent about when it comes to, well, I mean, how do we navigate personal liberty versus social responsibility? Am I an authority to say like which one needs to take precedence? Like, hey, like, you know, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. Everybody has to be vaccinated, even if, I mean, I personally gravitate towards social responsibility. I think there are circumstances where it is okay to try and rally people around some sort of collective action to mitigate collective risks. Yeah, I mean, again, the vaccine one is a very tricky one because obviously people feel very strongly, and of course because pharmaceutical companies don't have a very trust-inspiring track records when it comes to inspiring safety and inspiring people to actually think. So it's a very tricky thing in that aspect. So the thing with Aaron Rodgers was precisely right, that he was centered on vaccines, and then also that in very recent years he has become very close with Aubrey Marcus, which is another character that we like to poke fun at because of certain ways that he navigates the psychedelic world and certain ideas or things. And before, so there was the first game of the season last weekend, and the Jets were playing the Bills, and Aaron Rodgers was made to make his triumphant debut with the Jets after a lot of publicity and a lot of thing. And just before the game, he gave this interview in television where he said that the power of manifestation he's very much now kind of like discovering in the first phases of psychedelic discovery. He drank ayahuasca, which was also publicized a lot. He was a keynote speaker in psychedelic science in Denver, which was a very funny thing to me, that we made lots of memes about Aaron Rodgers and Aubrey Marcus being keynote speakers in psychedelic science, an organization that prides itself on evidence-based science and so on. And before the interview, before the game, he gave an interview about the power of manifestation and how the power of manifestation was going to be the thing that was going to carry the Jets to win the Super Bowl. And what ended up happening is that literally in the first or the second play that the Jets had, he ended up tearing up his Achilles heel and injuring himself and missing the rest of the season, which granted doesn't mean that the Jets are not going to win the Super Bowl, but it definitely puts a dent on their aspirations. So the whole post was basically pointing out the irony, right, of a person who is very decidedly not trustful of the medical establishment and, giving an interview about the force of manifesting your own reality and so on and so forth, getting injured in the first minute of the game. It was just pure, sheer irony, right? So that was kind of like the whole thing. A lot of people made a lot of fun of it on Twitter. There were all sorts of like really funny posts about what is Aaron Rodgers going to do now? Is he going to call his friend Joe Rogan for recommendations? Is he going to rub ivermectin on his Achilles heel instead of actually going to the doctor? Because, so.
Sure. Fair. It was funny that one of my students was in a coffee shop and she was just getting her coffee. She might even still be in the room. And she said she just overheard a barista talking to somebody ordering coffee, and they said, "Yep, that's the thing about ayahuasca. Makes you think you're a better athlete than you really are," or something like that. Like it's funny that it's just sort of like in the zeitgeist. That people know that there may be, sometimes you take ayahuasca and you get a little kooky.
Right. So, but just kind of get to wrap this up. The point was, Aaron Rodgers is definitely, making fun of Aaron Rodgers, even if he's injured, which by the way is not a life-threatening injury, is a torn Achilles heel that will end up his season. But the guy has had 18 magnificent, beautiful seasons with the Packers. He's a multimillionaire person living a luxurious life. And people felt also like very strongly about it. Like, oh, like, do you think it's okay to make fun of a person who just got injured? And like, really, like there was a degree of pushback for being mean, right, to Aaron Rodgers. And, to some level, I can empathize. Like, yeah, it sucks for any person, no matter who they are, to be injured, right? But the whole point was not like, oh, like we're reveling in the fact that Aaron Rodgers is injured because we want him to be injured, because we want him to suffer. It wasn't. It was the irony of the complex of things that happened leading up to the injury. And yet, again, like the reaction, right, like was very, very, very in the indignation. How, this is not very kind, it's not a very nice thing. Like the person got injured and this is how it shows. Like, okay, well, but what about all the other people that we make fun of that are not superstar quarterbacks and nobody says anything about, right? Like there's something about the parasocial relationship, again, like you said, that people are very much attached to their celebrities.
I got so torn into, and she wasn't even hurt, and I wasn't really even making fun of her. but do you remember when Greta went on a school strike for the environment?
Right.
And there was just a picture of her holding a sign in whatever language that is, and it said school strike for the environment. And all I did was Photoshop the word psilocybin over environment, school strike for psilocybin. You would have thought I punched her in the face.
Yeah.
The way people got so mad at me for not even, I wasn't even making fun of her. I was just kind of like enjoying the moment.
Right.
And yeah, people really came to her defense, boy. It was a big deal. I didn't take it
Yeah.
down, but it was a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this
I
has
get
been
it.
fun.
Yeah, definitely.
We've gone over time. We still have people in the audience. Um, do you feel like closing with like one audience question?
Sure. That's the one.
Um, Jenna, you want to ask a question? Because I was texting. I got a lot of questions from Jenna earlier today, so we might as well, if she's here.
I am here, and I had like 25 questions. And so like how to pick one, but since we were on the topic of memes and taking memes down, and I one of the questions that I had was like, did anyone from like higher tier psychedelic community, right? Like higher tier, ever reach out to you personally and say, like, this has gone too far? Like, yeah, you took the one down, but has anybody been like, oh no, 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 you can't make fun of us on that level?
No, but also I sometimes cheat because I mean, I have personal relationships with a lot of people in the psychedelic community. So, for example, this is maybe something that I'm revealing here for the first time. But when I went to the MAPS conference, I spoke at the MAPS conference, but also there were many aspects of the MAPS conference that were absolutely criticable, and I did I did do a series of memes criticizing maps very specifically, and also very specific people within the organization of the conference. But I did get advice, and let's say I consulted with good friends who are in the organization or are part of the scene.
Oh, you ran them by. You got approval.
I did. I mean,
From Easy.
well, I mean, not only easy, I mean,
Okay.
I made a meme of Bia, which I would never put out there unless I spoke with Bia personally before that. I wouldn't risk her wrath. But with Bia, with Easy, like the things that I thought were very important, but at the same time, like, hey, like I don't want this. I want to make a point. I don't want this to be hurtful. I don't want this to be mean. I want to tone it. I want to find the sweet spot where
Sure.
actually the point that I want to make is made, but also like I don't want to upset specific people just for being an asshole, right? So
Sure.
whenever I didn't do this for all of them. I definitely didn't do this for the Aaron Rodgers or Aubrey Marcus ones. That's the way that I see it, that's kind of like fair game. But yeah, I mean, when it came to things that I wasn't sure about, I did ask people and work together with some people to make sure that the message gets across, but at the same time, not necessarily watering it down, but also like just to make sure that I'm not stepping on toes that are just too much. So I mean,
Sure.
and again, like I appreciate the question. I might have if I wasn't cheating by actually consulting with people.
I mean, I feel like it's a really respectful, perfect, like even ground to be at, like, because it keeps it all in play, but like knowledgeable at the same time.
Right, exactly. And I actually did get criticism from people who thought that the like whatever critiques I put on the conference were actually mild, which is often it's also a very valid criticism. I think there was probably room for much more spicy critiques of the conference, but also like it's difficult. I guess it's difficult for me to separate my own role in it. I mean, I spoke at it, I participate in it. I have participated in the spoken at psychedelic conference for a long time. I'm also have my own interest in maintaining healthy relationships with people within this sphere.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, there was a room for spicier, harsher critiques, sure, but that's not necessarily that's not necessarily what I wanted to do. And there were plenty, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
there were pretty brutal ones out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the Friars Club say, you know, we roast the ones we love.
Right,
You know?
exactly.
It's nice to be able to meme the ones you love.
Yeah.
The article from the Oakland Hi-Fi folks, but they said they ran it by, like, they got permission, not permission, but like their criticism about the cost. They interviewed Rick Doblin for that critical article, and I really appreciate that dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah, my friend Dennis, he runs a very good page also in the space. It's called the Mycopreneur Podcast.
Love him.
Yeah, and Rick actually, I mean, Maps actually gave him the mandate to go around the conference with a puppet of Rick Doblin that they made, and just like interview people and talk shit about things. And yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of things can be said, but they're good sports, and they do, you know, they play along. And I think, you know, all in all, I do think that Maps handled very well both the criticism, you know, and all the different things that came out of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this whole interview and for answering my question. I have about 25 more. We'll just save those for next time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Jenna, you know, next time maybe you'll have the conversation.
I could totally handle that.
Adam, thank you so much. Did we lose him? Did he
I'm here.
froze? Oh no, you're there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. People can find you at Healing from Healing. Send my love to your wife. Send my love to your baby.
Yeah.
This will be up on YouTube soon. You know, please let me know if I can ever be of service. This was really a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Anytime.
Right on. And thank you all out there in TV land. We'll see you at the next one. Be well, everybody. Much love.